Thank you all for joining us. I'm spending a couple of minutes to let everyone get situated and join the webinar. Thank you also to all of those joining us via live stream on YouTube and Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our guests and audience from New York at the UN General Assembly and all the way to Doha and around the world. Thank you for joining us this Sunday. My name is Anna Rold. I am the publisher of Diplomatic Courier and your host for today's forum, the first of 4 that Qatar Foundation, in collaboration with the Permanent Mission of the State of Qatar, to the United Nations and Diplomatic Courier magazine are hosting in light of Global Goals Week. Now it's no longer news that the disruption the world has experienced this past year and a half due to the COVID-19 pandemic has been devastating for our children, our schools, our homes, and our planet. Now more than ever, we need to build resilient and innovative education models that prepare students to solve for issues beyond their own boundaries. And this is why our focus for today and the next few days ahead is the intersection of progressive education and sustainability. Above all, we understand that to solve these issues, we and our youth need to adopt an interdisciplinary mindset so that we may achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Whether you're joining us on this webinar here today and the next 3 days, and whether you're tuning in from our live stream channels on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, we invite you, our audience, to join in this conversation and let us know how you're working towards solving the UN SDGs. After all, the SDGs are not just the business of the UN General Assembly members, they're everyone's business. And it's now my pleasure and honor to introduce to you our first keynote speaker, Ms. Buthaina Al-Naimi, the President of Pre-University Education at Qatar Foundation, to give us a few remarks and welcome you all to today's session.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. Over 13 years ago, Qatar announced its plan for what it wants to achieve over the next 2 decades through the Qatar National Vision 2030. In the words of the Emir, His Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, the document was a vision and provided the direction in which for Qatar to develop, balancing the interests of present and future generations. Qatar National Vision 2030 was a bridge between the present and the future. One of its pillars is environmental development, which seeks to strike a balance between the development needs and protecting the environment. At Qatar Foundation, we are aligned closely to the nation's aspirations, and our strategic objectives aim to develop young minds to be knowledgeable and environment-conscious global citizens. A key strategic theme of Qatar Foundation is the protection and restoration of the environment, while balancing economic development and well-being, which is expected to have an impact on enabling widespread local adoption, monitoring, and advocacy of world-class sustainable, regenerative environmental standards and practices. Qatar Foundation plays an important role in contributing to the national and international sustainability agenda through its research, development, and innovation ecosystem, K-12 schools and universities, and platforms for dialogue and ideation like WISE, WISH, and the QF at UNGA series. Through these platforms, QF brings together multilateral stakeholders and contribute to the global thought development across health, education, family, and sustainability. Education is both a goal in itself and a means for achieving sustainable development. It is a key enabler. Global issues such as climate change urgently requires a shift in our lifestyles and a transformation of the way we think and act. To achieve this change, we need new skills, values, and attitudes that lead to more sustainable societies. Progressive education that is action-oriented and based on transformative pedagogy is needed to develop competencies for sustainable development. Students across the QF schools are encouraged to engage deeply and are given agency to define their positive contributions to the planet and the environment. The range of activities across our schools vary from simple school gardens, farm-to-table activities, and tower gardens to conferences and student-led research on environment and sustainability. We have noticed firsthand the incredible positive impact of directly integrating sustainability in K-12 curriculum and school culture on students, families, and the community. Qatar has engaged thousands of students around the world, not only to advocate for change, but also to take action through student-led initiative that supports schools and communities to be more sustainable through programs like recycling, reduced energy use, planting trees, and many more. In a week from today, Qatar Foundation will amplify the voices of youth and educators about the critical role education plays in the fight to combat climate change at the Youth for Climate event during pre-COP26 in Milan, through debates, panel discussions, and cross-cultural conversations. From there, QF will continue its journey to support climate action with a participation at COP26, where decision makers will meet to renew their commitments to the climate action agenda signed in COP21. QF will highlight the role of education in climate action by bringing together youth and educators to give them a seat at the table among decision makers. Through the QF event at UNGA, being held in alignment with the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, QF brings together experts to work to open up a worldwide conversation focused on how the potential of youth can be harnessed to drive action on climate change, how to create a more radical approach to climate change education that empowers children and young people to elevate their skills, awareness, and drive to contribute in the context of safeguarding our environment, and how EdTech could benefit from impact investing. These sessions will blend the themes of education and sustainability with the aim of unlocking new perspectives, ideas, and solutions for shaping the future of education and the planet. The QF at UNGA series is the beginning of our journey toward the WISE conference this December. The conference with the theme Generation Unmute will bring world experts and youth leaders to discuss how education can play a role in reclaiming the future of a generation heavily affected by today's action on climate policy. I look forward to our conversation today on empowering climate action through progressive education, and I hand it over back to you, Anna. Thank you all.
Thank you, Buthaina. And this was an excellent discussion and recap of all the interesting initiatives that Qatar Foundation has spearheaded, and the focus this year on youth and how all of the roads, these multilateral meetings, will lead to Doha in December. Thank you again so much for the work you're doing at Qatar Foundation. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the next session, Dominic Register, who is the education director for the program director for education initiatives and programs at Salzburg Global Seminar, and he is also a contributing editor at Diplomatic Courier. I will hand it over to him so he can begin the discussion today with our esteemed panelists. And also, I have noted on our chat here today and also on our live stream channels that you are participating, and it gives me great pleasure to see your comments. Please continue to do so. Let us know where you're coming from, and if you have any questions or comments that you would like to make, we are here to curate them and ask them of the panel. And Dominic, I look forward to hearing from you now.
Great, thank you, Anna, and welcome to everyone who's with us on Zoom or joining via any of the live stream platforms. As Anna said, we would welcome questions from you all for the panel as our conversation progresses. So this panel is going to consider some of what Buthaina talked about and respond to some of that, and then bring in some really interesting and important additional perspectives from their different organizations and personal experience. It's hard to think of a better panel to come together to talk about this topic. And I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have over the course of the next hour. So joining me in conversation is Jamil Ahmad, who's the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs for the United Nations Environment Programme, Carol O'Donnell, who's the Executive Director of the Smithsonian Science Education Centre, and Diane Whitehead, who's the CEO of Childhood Education International. The format that we're going to follow is I'm going to ask each of them an opening question in a second, and they will take between 3 to 5 minutes to respond to that and bring in examples of work that they're familiar with and deeply involved in or aware of. And then after that, we'll move into a more general conversation. And as you will know from the QF website and the publicity for this event, what we're really going to be talking about is how can we build more progressive education systems that are capable of empowering us to become more involved in climate action. So we would welcome questions, comments, examples that any of you are aware of interesting practice that we can use this platform to shine a light on and give more prominence to. So without further ado, Jamil, I would love to welcome you into the conversation. And Jamil, it would be great to hear, from your UN vantage point about some of the work that is going on across the UN family to support this agenda. And welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. As you just mentioned, this is an important agenda, and we heard from the previous speakers how climate change is posing an existential threat to humanity. The planet literally is on fire. If you have watched the developments across the globe in the last few months, wildfires, other harsh weather events, floods, droughts, and shortage of water, we are witnessing a crisis. This is a planetary crisis which has gone beyond the climate change problem that we have facing for the last so many years. The United Nations has engaged the world community, governments, other stakeholders for long in the fight against climate change. As you know, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change has been producing these reports since 1990. The first report was issued in 1990. The last one was issued just last month. In 30 years, the IPCC, under the umbrella of the United Nations, have been issuing these alarm bells that climate change is now a greater and greater threat. Unfortunately, that threat has not abated. In fact, it has exacerbated over the last 30 years. And during these 30 years, from the first report in 1990 to the last one just recently, the world population has grown by 2.5 billion to that tune. These are all young people, children, youth, other young people who have grown with the climate crisis. So it is very important for the international community, for all of us, to pay attention to how we can look after the interest and the future of youth, especially in the education sector, but as a holistic view. For that, the United Nations adopted a very broad agenda for development, for sustainable development, which is known as Agenda 2030. It was adopted in 2015, and now we are in the last decade of that agenda for implementation. It has a sustainable development goal in education, and also it has a goal on climate change. But the beauty of this agenda is that this is an integrated agenda where all these goals are connected, they are interrelated, and they are all indivisible. So the world, all of us, will have to put energies to implement this agenda in a holistic way. Within the goal for education and climate change, there are very strong links because currently, as I said, we have a very large youth population, 1.8 billion between the age of 14 to 25, and most of them are students, not all. That is another aspect that we have to keep in mind while talking of addressing climate change and the issues of youth. But one aspect where the United Nations has led proactively is to raise awareness about the dangers that climate change poses to to all of us. And then also, and that education is key to not only to raise awareness, but also to work for combating this universal issue. And as I said, it's a planetary issue now. It is now an issue which is combined with pollution, which is combined with loss of nature. So this planetary crisis definitely needs a holistic approach. And so for that, we'll have to develop strategies and policies to identify gaps, especially in the education sector. Where is it that work can be accelerated to fill these gaps so that the students and the universities can come in and work for work in a way that that leaves the student more empowered to work at their level also for these issues. UN, United Nations Environment Program, where I work, and UNESCO have been working for some time now to jointly collaborate to understand how the ministries of environment and how the ministries of education in countries, especially in developing countries where there's a lack of coordination among ministries, can join hands and do this. And for that, we also have to transform the skill sets at the universities and to better equip the universities to develop a curriculum and courses which address these issues. But going beyond that, I think due to the severity of the issue, we have to go beyond the formal curriculum and go to mediums which are outside the universities, like video games nowadays and other parts of entertainment for students, which should include an aspect, an element on environmental awareness, on how to take climate action. And we are also working, our United Nations Environment Program is also working in that. Intersectoral and international partnership, well, we can always say that that is also one fundamental element of the strategy. And the countries who have signed up, all countries have signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. That work is going on. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, calls it the decade of action. So we are now into the decade of action. We don't have much time. According to a UNEP report, which was released recently, we have to, the world has to reduce its greenhouse gases by 3.6% each year for the next 10 years, if we are to meet the goal of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions to less than 3 degrees, the warming to less than 3 degrees Celsius. It is a Herculean task, and I'm afraid we are not on path to that objective. We are still way behind, even if all the obligations, if all countries meet their obligations under the Paris Agreement on climate change, we will still need more action. So and the scenario is not very positive, but with the energy of youth and with the energy and the commitment of teachers and others, I think the education sector can be a pioneer in telling the others how to do it. In our own organization, we have engaged with youth in big way, not only with youth movement, but also with youth organizations and individual activists of environment and climate. And in that, what we have tried is to develop a set of skill sets which can be used. One is called the Little Book of Green Nuggets, which is a project for sustainable behavior. Because as I mentioned, individual action will be important at all levels. We know the footprint of our resource consumption is very high. We are using the resources unsustainably, and that is one reason why the Sustainable Development Goal has a special goal on sustainable consumption and production. So behavioral change, especially among youth, who will be the future of this planet, is very important. We know from another study that the footprint of Generation Z accounts to $100 billion annually. And this much of amount is enough for meeting the targets of hygiene, sanitation, and clean water under the Sustainable Development Agenda. Our organization, must point this out, this is very important, is working on a project which will be launched next year, and which is for developing nature positive universities. This will allow the universities to measure the footprint of their carbon and reduce it with steps ahead. So I think we have a challenging scenario ahead of us, and I think the United Nations will always play its role by allowing its convening space to the community, to the students, to other stakeholders, but also help design policies which can be implemented at all levels, and especially engage the youth also. The Secretary General of the United Nations is focusing great emphasis on engagement of youth and universities for this purpose. So I'll stop here, and maybe we can then go to the question and answer session and respond to your questions if there are any.
Great, Jamil, thank you very much for that wide-ranging opening about the breadth of activity that the UN is involved in. I think your point about how the climate crisis is obviously a planetary issue, but that both the responsibility and the short and midterm consequences of that crisis are not borne equally at the moment. And I think the issue of climate justice is something that I know we're going to come back to in the panel. I also really appreciated you highlighting some of the work that UNEP is involved in, like the Nature Positive Universities program and the Green Nuggets, and also your kind of clarion call around the importance of hope and optimism in this space, that we do all need to believe in the aggregation of individual actions contributing to a bigger difference. And finally, I think the point you made was really valid about the importance of looking beyond curriculum and at non-formal or informal opportunities for driving this kind of behavior change. Curriculum is obviously another very important and significant way in which we can work with young people and help them develop the skills and knowledge and ways of behaving that they will need in order to tackle this challenge during their lifetimes. And Carol, I'd love to bring you in at this point, if that's okay, because I know curriculum is an area of expertise for the Smithsonian Center for Science Education. So we'd love to learn more about some of the work that you've been involved in around curriculum design, please. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dominique. And I appreciated, the opening remarks for Buthaina and Anna, and also from you, Jamil, to understand the broader sense of the UN, as well as the Qatar Foundation. So my name is Carol O'Donnell, and I'm the director of the Smithsonian Science Education Center. And we are one organization within the Smithsonian who we focus specifically on educating youth around the globe on issues related to science. We have 3 goals, which is innovation, inclusion, and sustainability. And all of them are related to one another and intersect. You cannot address issues of sustainability without also thinking about equity and inclusion. And you also use science, innovation, to address many of these issues. So in my position at the Smithsonian, I'm not only the director of the Smithsonian Science Education Center, I also sit on what's called the UN Broadband Commission for School Connectivity and Hybrid Learning. And I see that there are questions in the chat from Sahar, for example, and also from Buthaina's opening remarks around the role that technology plays in all of this, as well as addressing the digital divide and trying to educate youth around sustainability issues, including climate change. There's also a comment in here from Mehdi, which asks about the role that action taking plays in educating youth. And so to address, I think, both of those points, the Smithsonian Science Education Center, in my role sitting on the Inter-Academy Partnership for Science Education Global Council, which is 142 different countries who've come together through their national academies of sciences, engineering, and medicine to learn how to translate the science that Jamil just talked about into actionable efforts for youth. And Dominique, in your question, you asked about curriculum. And the Smithsonian believes that the science that we see, whether it's in the IPCC report or in other scientific reports that talk about science education, and maybe Dominique, you can, thank you. What we've done is we have worked with the Inter-Academy Partnership to develop a project called Smithsonian Science for Global Goals. This project started in January of 2016, in which Zika was a prominent issue, scientific issue throughout the globe. And we decided, what could scientists do to educate youth on issues around mosquito-borne diseases? And out of that project was born a project called Smithsonian Science for Global Goals, which is the book chapter that you see at the bottom of this slide. But we didn't want to just dive into developing curriculum, because many instructional, and when I say curriculum, I'm talking about instructional resources. Many instructional resources that teachers use in their classrooms to educate their youth on scientific topics are driven by broader policy issues, broader standards that are set by the nation. But there has to be some type of framework. Well, when you're educating youth within a particular region or nation, there are no global standards or global curriculum. And so the question became, what could we potentially use to drive education around these important issues like climate change, climate action, like environmental justice, or sustainable communities, or as Jamil mentioned, consumption and production? What could we use to educate youth on these issues? And we decided that we would develop a framework that was based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we extracted from those goals all of the incredible science that is embedded in those 17 goals. And we used what Anna talked about, an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach. But we needed a pedagogical framework to develop curriculum or instructional materials to educate youth on these issues. And we decided to develop what we call the Global Goals Action Progression. And so this framework that you see in front of you is designed to understand that youth, which Jamil defined as students who are from ages 5 to say 24, that youth come to educators with a particular cultural context, they have a particular learning disposition, and they also have background knowledge. And they come to us with a lot of questions. Now, unfortunately, in schools today, many of our teachers do not have the background knowledge to teach climate change education. And I know that our colleague Diane will talk a little bit about what we're doing to support teachers in that way. But one of the ways is to develop curriculum materials or instructional materials to support teachers. So our belief, our framework, is that when students come to us, they come to us with particular questions about the world around them. But those questions are embedded in their own local cultural context, their own learning disposition, their own background knowledge. And so we need to give youth an opportunity to do what we call discover, which is to engage in surveying their community to better understand the world around them, to understand the issue from their local perspective, and then to investigate that issue on a local scale in order to better understand it and to engage in critical thinking and critical reasoning. After they've had a chance to survey their community to better understand the issue, then we believe it's time for them to use their community as their laboratory. And this is where they're engaging not only in critical reasoning about the issue on a local scale, but they're also starting to see the issue from a systemic position. So engaging in systemic understanding. From there, the idea is that students would then synthesize their understanding of the issue. They've engaged in local investigations to better understand climate change impacts, to better understand sustainable communities or consumption and production on a local scale, to better understand the impacts of mosquito-borne diseases. Once they've done that and they've been able to synthesize that information, then we believe that they then need to use that information to do social good in their region. which we heard from the opening remarks today. And that is this idea of local action. If students are able to engage in this very iterative process where they're going through this discover, understand, and act framework, which is completely cyclical. Once you've engaged in action on the local scale, youth then believe that they've come up with new questions and new understandings, which drive them to continue to engage in this discover, understand, act framework. And this is all to build what UNESCO calls cultural, or I would say social understandings or social outcomes, which is through discover, cognitive outcomes through understanding, and behavioral outcomes from action. Ultimately, the goal here is to build students' sustainability mindsets and their scientific literacy. So on the next slide, I want to share with you, what do we mean when we say we want to engage students in sustainability mindsets? You see 5 things here. And this is how we define the goal of sustainability mindsets. The first is that there is this belief that personal action can lead to positive change. And that's this idea of empowerment and agency. And when we engage in developing curriculum materials or instructional materials to support youth in these issues, what we find is that when we assess them in advance, they often don't believe that they have the ability to make a difference in their local community. But when we assess them afterwards, they say, I absolutely can make a difference in my local community and globally by changing the behavior of myself and others. That's agency. The second in the lower left-hand corner is open-mindedness and reflection. The importance that students have to engage in these social emotional learning opportunities where they're understanding not only their own perspectives, but the perspectives of others. And that these perspectives are not just, as we heard earlier, not just environmental, but also economic, social, cultural. And the next is around equity and justice. So students are going to develop sustainability mindsets. They have to respect themselves and others, and also see the importance of the balance between the human's needs and the needs of the environment. And finally, and ultimately, if we are able to develop students' sustainability mindsets through instructional materials or curriculum materials that guide students' learning, then we're able to make this connection between global and local issues. That's what we would say are students' considered actions or more advanced actions. So I know that our colleague Diane is going to talk about the role of teachers. When you develop curriculum or instructional resources that are built on the policies or scientific ideas that have come from others like the UN or our scientific community, like the Inter-Academy Partnership, 143 countries with National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or the Smithsonian, you do know that those instructional materials alone won't make a difference, that teachers have to have the knowledge and skill set and the tools in order to help youth address and develop these sustainability mindsets. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Dominique. I know there's a lot to talk about, but I hope that that's at least a beginning way of thinking about this as a framework that anybody could use.
Carol, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for explaining all of that and setting out the process. It's such a powerful model. Do you have a sense of how many countries around the world have started to use this curriculum? Because it's a free resource, isn't it, that people can access?
It's a free resource, and right now we've developed, and I can put the link in the chat, but right now we've developed 9 resources that are available for free, which cover topics like sustainable communities, and that is our most recent release, which just happened 2 days ago. And mosquito-borne diseases, which focus on infectious disease, COVID-19, vaccines. So the science of vaccines and what you can do as a young student, not to go out and get a vaccine, that may not be possible, but to share your scientific knowledge to others in order to change their behavior through these intergenerational conversations.
Right.
And yes, those are free. And we are working right now on one on environmental justice, which is a climate justice issue, and also one on biodiversity loss. And I just want to say that, and we heard this morning from the other speakers, climate change is not about, as Jamil said, just one issue. All of the issues within the UN Sustainable Development Goals have climate justice at the center in some way. And you'll see that in the free resources that we're providing to others. And to answer your question, we work with about 4.3 million youth across the globe per year and their teachers. And we work through broader community partners. So we're in every single nation, every single continent. And hopefully we'll continue to grow with the support of our donors.
Fantastic, thank you. And I mean, for the audience, if you're interested in hearing more about this from an organization which is working very closely with Carol, then in Tuesday's panel, Manjula Dissanayake from the Educate Lanka Foundation will be one of our guests. And Educate Lanka have a partnership with the Smithsonian and have been using these resources and some of their education work in Sri Lanka. So thank you very much, Carol. And as you said on a couple of occasions, when we think about education reform in any context, but certainly with regards to climate action and climate change, then reforms to the curriculum can only get you so far. It's also absolutely essential to work very closely with teachers and education leaders, on both on a mindset shift and on the skills that are needed to deliver new content. And Diane, that's an area that Childhood Education International has done some really interesting work around. So I would love to welcome you to our virtual stage and invite you to say a little bit about some of the education leadership and teacher training programs that Childhood Education International is working on, please.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate being here, and thank you to everyone who sort of kicked us off this morning and got us started in this interesting and really critical topic. So yes, I'm Diane and CEO of Childhood Education International. And a little bit about our organization for you. We are an old organization, as Carol reminded me the other day. We're not quite as old as the Smithsonian Institution, but we did begin in 1892. I think the Smithsonian was in 1840 something. So there we go. So both of us are organizations that have a long history in doing this type of work. We've really focused in a lot through the years on sort of the early years of life and looking at sort of pre-primary and primary education, because we believe this is where a lot of the formation of habits and lifelong sort of learning skills are adopted. So that's where our focus is, although it doesn't, we do sometimes work with youth age groups, and certainly the connection for us to those children is through teachers and through leaders. So that's very important to us. We have 3 practice areas: transformational leadership, which I'll talk about in a moment, child health and well-being, and then one we call rethinking education, which I think gets to the spirit of innovation that is so important in thinking about how we move and change schools today. We have got to have innovations being adopted in schools and school systems to be able to make change happen. And of course, we have to be careful. We don't want to willy-nilly adopt innovations all over the place that aren't going to be helpful. So we look carefully at innovations that work, innovations that have been tried, proven to work. And then how do you scale those up within the education system? And also, sometimes innovations don't need to be scaled up. They're innovations just that are working in that particular school. So this decision-making around scaling up innovations or not to scale, how to scale, is critically important. We do work on issues of inclusion and equity. We have a program that we share globally, training programs on inclusion and equity, because we also believe that that's really going to be critical to formulating how we look at sort of fairness and issues of climate justice in our world. We have got to have equitable and inclusive schools, and we have to mirror that in our societies in order to ensure that climate change is not something that we just talk about, but it's something that we care about as far as who it's affecting in the world, right? We know that there's a disproportionate effect for children who are living in circumstances where climate may be really impacting their communities tremendously, and we need to look at those issues as well. We are involved in the UN network. We have many places within UN agencies where we connect and we provide consultations within those networks. We're an official UNESCO, official NGO in partnership with UNESCO, and we have other connections that we make. And this is where we can really have an impact in sort of sharing our viewpoints on the importance of climate change in the world today, and how we can really help to support teachers. So our network consists of about 35 to 40 country leads. They're on all different continents. We really believe that the best information we can get is receiving information from the ground. We want to hear from people who are living in circumstances where climate and environmental problems are creating issues for them. We want to hear their voice. And so we really do try to open our organization up to listening. Listening is incredibly important to us, to hear the struggles that those communities are facing, the challenges that teachers are having, and how this is impacting children and their education experience. Leadership, I'd like to talk just a little bit about leadership, this transformative leadership area that I talked about. That is becoming critical, because we know that as much as we help and support teachers and get them wonderful instructional materials and resources and design new curriculums, it's the leaders of these schools that have to actually carry out these new changes that are happening, and they have to know why climate change is important. So leadership is something that we talk about a lot. In fact, we look at one of our major audiences for our organization being education leaders. We also know that we consider teacher leaders as well. We know that teachers serve as leaders just by the virtue that they are in the classroom, leading that classroom and supporting school activities. But those critical leaders, principals, heads of schools, people who are working in regional administrations, people at the international level who are leading these wide sort of ranging climate change initiatives, that's very important to us. And transformational leadership, because there have been many types of leadership models that have been adopted in schools throughout the years. But this is what we feel is sort of the critical point of change. Transformational leaders really inspire others, and they look at innovation and they know how to manage change. So that's something that we provide trainings and information on transformational leadership. And I'd just like to speak sort of quickly about the university issue as well. This is critical. We can have well-trained teachers. We can have wonderful leaders. We can be, again, providing all these incredible resources to our teachers. But unless we have universities that are really, really accepting of education for sustainable development, as far as a framework for how they look at teacher preparation and teacher education, this is going to be a challenge. Universities and teacher preparation programs in general are going to be key to how we move forward new climate change action in education. And that cannot be stated sort of strongly enough. So we do get ourselves involved at times in looking at this issue of what's happening in universities. We support the United Nations Academic Impact. Academic Impact is an initiative that helps universities to adopt the SDGs. And we know that once we can get a university to adopt the SDGs and to understand how critical they are, then that can filter down to various departments, including teacher education departments within that university. So they're a critical sort of hinge for that. And the universities are going to be central, absolutely central to how we move this forward. When you look at the types of partners that we've got to have working together in order to make this change happen quickly, because it is urgent. We've certainly got to have governments and ministries working together. We've got to have professional standards developed for teacher certification and training. We've got to have everybody sort of involved in this, and it's got to be a collective of institutions and organizations working together to make this change. So that is something that's important, and we have an initiative we call education diplomacy, which really looks at this sort of integrated, how do we integrate within the education sector, and then how do we look at the intersectoral work that's going to be needed, and then again, how are leaders, right, critical in shaping that. So our education diplomacy initiative looks at diplomatic communication, consensus building, collaboration, and then moves to levels of collective action and collective impact. So that's how we're sort of involving ourselves in these issues at this time. And there's a lot of work to be done. I was looking back at one of my school books, just a quick note I grew up in the UK. I was looking back at one of my school books, and we had little books that we would write in for each of the subject areas. And I had one book that was dedicated to nature, and it just had nature written on the front of it. And it's like, so what has happened to our nature education? And I know we're doing wonderful things in science education and in STEM education, but we've lost a little bit of that drive to just look at the pure world around us and how we can really engage children in being those global citizens that we want them to be, as far as finding these solutions to these ecological challenges. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Diane. I suppose you've illustrated another really beautiful aspect of the kind of curriculum approach that Carol was talking about. And how do you help students connect and engage very much with the areas in which they live, and then think about how they can address, how they can use what they're learning in school to address different kinds of challenge. I'd love to talk just a little bit more about the leadership dimension in all of this, if that's okay, and ask whether there are examples of really interesting practice that you've come across of systems or individual schools where they're supporting a next generation of leaders to develop the kind of capabilities which are going to be needed in order to create the right culture in school to support this, whether there are a couple of resources or anything that you'd like to highlight.
Yeah, so there's an awful lot that's been written about transformative, what we call transformative leadership. It's actually also at times called transformational leadership, but transformational leadership can be more of a mouthful. And there are incredible books and resources on this topic. Some of the important resources are the ones that actually hone in on this leading change type of issue, and those are going to be critical in how we think about this. And as far as like our network itself, we actually look to the examples in our network. We know in Tanzania, there's a university that we work with that is doing wonderful work in leadership, and how not only sort of looking at leadership for teachers, right, for teachers who are going out into the school to teach, but also looking at how we teach children about leadership. So how do we sort of shape the mindsets of children at a very young age to understand these critical kinds of elements of leadership, of managing change, of surviving change. And that's something that I think is incredibly important. So we do have some good examples of that in Tanzania, in Kenya. A group that we're working with is really looking at, and again, another university affiliated group looking at this issue of leadership. And we know that incredible work, again, has been done around leadership throughout the years. We know that a lot of this began in the 1990s when leadership was becoming a topic of true sort of importance in the world. But it's come to the point, and maybe that's a good thing, right? We've had time now to sort of work through some of what works in leadership and education and what doesn't. And we found that there's this great need, right? Sort of a gap in some of the leadership programs that were adopted earlier on in this managing change area.
Thank you. And thank you for the example from Tanzania as well. I'd love to bring in a few questions, if that's okay, that have been coming up in the chat. There's quite a number of questions about the impact of the pandemic on different aspects of what we've been discussing. And there's a lot of connection has been made over the last 18 months between, what we can learn from effective responses to the disruption that the pandemic caused to education and how that can help us prepare or build more resilience into education systems for the challenges that the climate crisis is going to present. I've heard many people say variations on this phrase. The first person I have mentioned it was Anja Nielsen from UNICEF, so I always attribute it to her, but the idea that the pandemic is akin to a classroom test and the climate crisis is the end of year exam and the really significant challenge that we're going to be facing. So I would love to hear from Carol, Jamil, Diane, examples of lessons from the pandemic that can help us think through the kind of responses that we need to see in the years ahead to address the climate challenge.
So if you don't mind, I'll just start, but very quickly, that in the past year, there have been several issues that have come up. And I think the issues around justice and equity have been at the heart, because what we've seen unfortunately, from the pandemic and continue to see is that those who have the fewest resources continue to have the fewest resources, and that many of the issues that we face that are these complex global wicked challenges, including climate change or issues like the pandemic, tend to impact people in the most under-resourced regions the most. And so I think the first and foremost thing is just raising awareness of how we create more equity through education, in ensuring that people have the information that they need to make decisions and empower themselves in their own actions. And I think that science and data have been first and foremost in all of our minds over the past year and a half. We've been hopefully either doing one of two things: following the scientific data and recognizing the importance of it to help us understand, for example, how to protect ourselves and others from the spread of the pandemic, the spread of the disease, or we've ignored that science or miscommunicated or information that is pseudoscience or misinformation. And so I think that the pandemic over the past year and a half has not only raised our awareness around inequities, but it's also raised the importance of science and scientific data and the role that that communities play in sharing scientific information with one another, so science communication. And so I'll stop there. Lots to say, of course, about the pandemic, but the role of science, scientific data, and also this idea of unfortunate inequities that have been highlighted.
Thank you, Carol. Diane, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I would. I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of lessons learned as far as parent involvement, which is something that, has been sort of less perhaps highlighted. We get a lot of sort of, we know that it's changed the way that we look at technology. It's changed the way that we look at, certainly remote learning and things like that are things that are talked about a lot. But this parent involvement idea is kind of critical. We found that parents had to be involved all over the world, right, in school. And we know that there are various levels of parent involvement in every school we visit worldwide. This was the first time where parents had to sort of really come together with schools in a new way to ensure that their child could continue learning. So the parent-teacher partnership is something that became critically important. So we know that a lot of this worked very well. We did have parents who were able to step in and engage with the schools more, teachers who were connecting with parents more. But there were places where this wasn't happening as well. So we can take some of the lessons learned about what worked in parent involvement, right? What didn't work? What were the barriers? We know that parents are extremely busy, many working, many have, several children they have to attend to. That was exhausting, right? During the pandemic, when you had several children online and in remote learning. So we know that there were a lot of challenges. So we can kind of really take this moment in time, put it under a microscope and say, what was working well, what didn't work well in this parent involvement kind of engagement that had to happen. I also think something we don't look at a lot is sort of this idea of emergency planning for schools, right, during crisis. And that was something many schools were not prepared, right, for this to happen. They had emergency plans in various areas that they lived, depending on things that might happen in the natural environment. But a pandemic was something that people had not expected. So how do we look at emergency planning for schools? How do we get the community involved with it? And how do we get the children involved? We don't want to traumatize children around emergency, but they have solutions to problems, right? And how do we look at sort of planning for things that might happen, which gives the children a little bit more feel of security. So emergency planning was something that I thought was interesting.
Thank you for that, Diane. And the issue of emergency planning is really interesting. It came up in a UNGA panel that Anna and I were involved in last year with WISE as well, which was to a book launch for a book of essays around the theme of education, disrupted education reimagined, that we'd worked on over the course of the last year, that looked at how different institutions and systems were responding to the pandemic and what was working and why it was working. And there's a brilliant case study in the book from Sierra Leone, where the author talks about because of Sierra Leone's experiences with Ebola a decade earlier, they had some very robust systems in place that allowed the education system to kind of pivot and adapt very quickly to the challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic was presenting.
Again, it's a system-wide issue, right?
Yeah.
It's sorry, Jamil.
No, it's okay. I think I was just trying to refer to the point that Dominic made just now about countries which are further down south and who have not this experience of emergency like COVID before, unlike Sierra Leone, which dealt with Ebola. So there are a huge number of countries who are dealing already with the crisis, with the climate crisis, and then COVID put everything upside down. So